very much. I would also like to start to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to present today a paper about a topic which is part of my PhD thesis. As my English is that good, I will have to stick to my notes, so please excuse this, but I think it's better for us to understand. So, to start with, I would like to focus on the situation in Austria-Hungary and then move on to the actual relief effort. Austria-Hungary was a multinational empire which comprised of 19 crown lands and about 11 different nationalities. By the middle of the 19th century, conflicts started between the various nationalities and the central government about the extent of their political rights. During the following decades, the stances of the involved parties became more and more radical, and at the turn of the century, some groups openly sympathized with the potential rivals of the Habsburg monarchy. Hence, these unsettled national conflicts posed a serious challenge for the future of the empire. However, despite these internal conflicts, the mobilization of the Austrian-Hungarian army went off without a hitch in 1914 and inspired the hopes of patriotic intellectuals about a new era without national unrest. Yet, the war also cooled the national disputes, for example, through the handling of Austrian-Hungarian prisoners of war abroad. Some countries tried to exploit the struggles between the various nationalities within the Habsburg monarchy for their own war aims. By granting privileges to prisoners who belonged to allegedly unsatisfied peoples, or even recruiting them for volunteer units to fight against the Habsburg monarchy. This kind of Nationalitätenpolitik or nationalities policy caused a lot of deep conflicts and increased the distrust among Austro-Hungarian prisoners abroad. On the other hand, ill-conceived or imperfect relief efforts by the Austro-Hungarian government fueled resentments toward other ethnic groups within the Habsburg monarchy or towards the monarchy as a whole. This is well illustrated by a letter written by an Austrian-Hungarian prisoner from Samara to Bohemia in 1960. After complaining about the inequitable distribution of Liebesgaben or charitable gifts at Topoe, he concluded, and I quote, "It's not surprising that the prisoners take various means which are detrimental to Austria." Quote end. Hence, the loyalty of the prisoners was not only seriously endangered by the policies of the captors, but also by perceived or actual insufficient relief efforts. Considering these facts, my paper aims to examine which efforts the Austrian-Hungarian government made in order to support its prisoners abroad and to shed light on central motives and intentions behind the monarchy's official prisoners of war relief effort. I will argue that the concerns about the future of the empire represent the essential driving forces behind the Austrian-Hungarian relief effort. Between August 1914 and November 1918, the Habsburg monarchy called about 9 million men to arms, and almost one-third of them ended up in captivity. Maybe the following four factors are responsible for the high number of Austrian-Hungarian prisoners. First, the war of movement, especially on the Eastern Front. Then, bad leadership by commanding officers and or the high command. But also poor conditions in general, which spurred desertion. In the winter of 1914-15 at the front of the Carpathians. And last but not least, the unsettled conflicts between the various nationalities within the empire, which also spurred desertion. Most Austrian soldiers became prisoners on the Eastern Front, mainly in so-called big catches. For example, during the first 10 days of the Brusilov offensive, more than 130,000 Austrian soldiers ended up in Russian custody. In total, about 2.1 million members of the Austrian army were captured by the Russians. About 1 million of them belonged to one of the Slavonic peoples of the monarchy. On the southwestern front, the fighting started at the end of May 1915 and lasted until November 1918. In contrast to the east, the war on the Italian front resembled more to fighting on the western front. Despite heavy fighting, the front line did not change much until October 1918, except for the 12th Battle on the Isonzo in 1917. During the nearly 3.5 years of fighting, between 100 and 180,000 Austro-Hungarian officers and soldiers were captured by the Italian army. So let's move on to the Austro-Hungarian prisoners in Russia. Estimates about the death toll of Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war in Russia ranged from 17.6% up to 25%, which would mean that between 400 and 600,000 of them had died in captivity. How can we explain these high figures? A report written by the Austro-Hungarian War Ministry based on letters of prisoners named several correct factors, and I quote, poor accommodation, lack of clothing, inadequate nutritional intake, the Russian climate and the Russian system produced an alarmingly high occurrence of infectious diseases among the POWs. Particularly during the first years of the war, the living conditions of the prisoners posed a serious threat to their health and life. Although the treatment of the prisoners in Russia was often contrary to international law, in most cases the authorities did not deliberately violate the Hague Conventions. The hardship resulted rather from organizational inefficiency and scare capacities. In any case, the poor living conditions pose also a serious challenge for the Austro-Hungarian government, as its imprisoned subjects expected responsiveness, commitment, and the best assistance possible from the official bodies of the Habsburg monarchy. Hence, the prisoners got the impression that after they had done their duty, their fatherland now was not able to care properly for them, their loyalty would be affected in a negative way. However, ill-conceived or imperfect efforts by the Austro-Hungarian government were neither the only nor the greatest threat to the loyalty of the Austro-Hungarian prisoners. A far more serious threat stemmed from the Russian policy on certain ethnic groups among the prisoners. Immediately after the outbreak of the war, the authorities issued an order which stipulated that the Austro-Hungarian prisoners should be separated according to their ethnic origin. Prisoners of Slavonic or Italian origin were granted several privileges, e.g. their working conditions were usually better than those of German-speaking Austrians or Magyars. The preferential treatment and the misuse of power by privileged prisoners put their comrades at a disadvantage, drove a wedge between the Austrian prisoners and fueled the mistrust and anger towards certain nationalities. Austrian prisoner Karl Kasser, who was in January 1970 in Tumen, in Siberia, wrote, and I quote, and the Czech opposed us, as you can imagine. Well, they were grouped separately, while fights and brawls erupted, with the result that some lost their lives in the camp. But the Russian authorities not only granted privileges to certain groups of prisoners, they also enabled Serbian and Italian representatives to recruit Austro-Hungarian prisoners of Italian and South Slav origin for volunteer units in order to fight against the Central Powers. Moreover, the Russian authorities themselves engaged in recruiting prisoners for units like the Czech Legion. However, not all of these volunteers had joined these units by choice. Many prisoners were forced to join these units either by the Russian authorities or by their disloyal compatriots. In total, between 120,000 and 130,000 prisoners from Russian nationality served within such units. This policy constituted not only a breach of international law, but also fueled conflicts between the prisoners across and within the nationalities. Albeit the majority of the Italian, Romanian, and Slavonic Austrian-Hungarian prisoners in Russia remained loyal throughout the war, the Russian nationalities policy posed a serious threat to the future of the monarchy as it intensified the existing clinchages between its peoples. Finally, a third threat for the loyalty of the prisoners arose from the revolution which promoted and fueled socialist idealism. Now let's look to Italy. In Italy, the authorities also employed the nationalities policy. Already the first Italian regulations for the handling of prisoners stipulated that the captured Austrian soldiers should be separated according to their nationality. Albeit the Italian War Ministry argued that this step was necessary in order to prevent, and I quote, political discussions and quarrels, among the prisoners, it is hard to believe that this should have been the only reason for this measure. However, in the first place, the Italian authorities focused mainly mainly of Austrian-Hungarian deserters and prisoners of Italian nationality. If they were found to be loyal towards the Italian state, able to look after themselves, they were released and could settle down in a village or a city. At latest, during 1917, the Italian authorities started to grant certain privileges to prisoners of Czech and or Slovak origin, and actively supported their recruitment for voluntary units. Just like in Russia, these policies fought through conflicts between disloyal and loyal prisoners across and within the Austrian nationalities. Having said this, one has also to find that the Italian nationalities policy never matched the scope and intensity of its Russian counterpart. And there was another significant difference in the handling of the POWs by those two countries. The living conditions and the treatment in the Italian camps were significantly better than in Russia, which in part may have also been a result of the comparatively low number of the prisoners in Italy. There were of course shortcomings, e.g. many rank and file prisoners complained about poor food, and there were several instances of misuse. However, the Austrian censorship and the YMCA delegates who inspected and worked in many camps agreed that the overall situation of the prisoners was quite good. Nevertheless, Austrian prisoners in Italy expected, like their compatriots in Russian camps, that the government would support them. During the first months of 1915, the Austrian authorities learned about poor living conditions in many Russian camps, and soon they also became all too aware of the Russian nationalities policy. In principle, they had three options available in order to counter these developments. First, formal protests, second, retortion, and third, relief operations. Unfortunately, formal protests proved to be slow and in most cases inefficient, whereas the use of retortions threatened to worsen the situations for the prisoners on both sides. Hence, in spring 1915, the Austrian War Ministry came around to view substantial relief operations as the only way to support the Austrian POWs abroad. But how should the relief supplies get to the camps, and who could supervise their distribution? In order to settle these questions, negotiations took place between the Red Cross societies of Austria, Hungary, Sweden, and the war ministries of Austria, Hungary, and Russia. In the end, the Swedish Red Cross Society took over this task. And in October 1915, substantial relief operations got underway. Until 1918, the Swedish Red Cross delegates distributed among the Austrian POWs in Russia in total, their quote, 375,000 complete uniforms, about 1.2 million pairs of underwear, 150,000 pairs of boots, and 300,000 blankets, as well as several grain cars containing biscuits and tinned meat. Besides this, the Austrian authorities organized, in cooperation with the Red Cross societies, the supply of medical goods for their imprisoned compatriots. Between 1916 and 1918, Austria-Hungary sent 32 rail cars with medical equipment ranging from medicaments and surgical instruments to Feldbadegarnituren or dressing aids and equipment for washing the war-bounded to Russia. Furthermore, Austria-Hungary took part in the so-called Schwestern Eisen or traveling nurses in 1915 and 1916. Proposals to allow Red Cross nurses from enemy countries to visit their imprisoned compatriots stemmed from the mother of the Tsar. Due to the mediation of the Danish Red Cross, Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary agreed in 1915 and again in 1916 that three, respectively six, German and Austrian nurses would be granted access to camps in Russia. In return, Russian sisters could visit their imprisoned compatriots in Germany and Austria-Hungary. Each delegation consisted of a nurse, a Danish officer, and a representative of the capital state. During their visits, they detected many grievances and were able to remedy several of them by formal protests. Moreover, the Austrian nurses also provided immediate relief by distributing money and harmless Liebesgaben among the POWs. However, neither were the nurses able to detect all defects, nor were they able to meet the expectations of all prisoners. Especially among the rank and file prisoners, criticism about the attitude and or the relief by the aristocratic Austrian versus was voiced. Nevertheless, the majority of the prisoners appreciated their work. Besides these central relief operations, the Austrian authorities undertook several other initiatives which we can maybe address in the discussion afterwards. So what was the situation in the southwest? On the southwestern front, the relief operations got underway in 1960. Here the relief effort rested mainly on three pillars. The first one was constituted by the allocation of financial means for neutral delegates who visited the camps in Italy. The second and main pillar was constituted by the allocation of financial means for the acquisition of clothes. Many prisoners, especially those who had been transferred from Serbia to Italy, had often only had uniforms or even no uniforms at all. The third pillar was constituted by the supply of books. For that purpose, an expert in classical and ancient studies was attached to the Austrian legation at Bern in the summer of 1960. In the same weeks, he organized the supply of books in cooperation with the Swiss Relief Organization, and by August 1916, he had already collected more than 14,000 books in Chinese. From the aforesaid, it became obvious that compared to the massive relief operations for the Austrian POWs in Russia, the relief effort for those in Italy remained comparatively small. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, the total number of Austrian POWs in Italy was significantly lower than in Russia. And secondly, the Austrian authorities assessed the treatment of the prison compatriots in Italy as quite okay. Hence, the fate of the prisoners in Russia attracted the main attention of the Austrian officials. And then we move on to the last section. We will look on the central motives for these relief operations. The Austrian authorities were quite aware of the fact that the loyalty of the Austrian prisoners was endangered by policies of the capital states. Moreover, they also recognized that an insufficient or imperfect relief effort would increase the threat that prisoners would become disloyal or at least prone to revolutionary ideas. In 1917, for example, the War Ministry warned that Austrian POWs were feeling increasingly abandoned by their own government. Exactly where and when this growing discontent will emerge is not to be foreseen. Therefore, it was necessary to provide significant financial resources for the support of the prisoners so that they would not, and I quote, return home with great dissatisfaction. The social and political implications of such an occurrence were not yet measurable, quote end. Hence, it becomes evident that the officials were aware of the importance of the relief effort in order to keep Austrian prisoners loyal. However, securing loyalty was by no means the only motive behind the relief effort. At least three other motives came into play. Financial calculations, worries about national economy, and military considerations. The War Ministry calculated that the care for the families of prisoners who had either died in captivity or returned incapable of work would pose a far greater strain to the annual budget than the actual costs of the various relief operations. Ernst Ritter von Sterowitz, who worked at the POW department of the Austrian War Ministry, estimated that if 100,000 POWs would die or become incapable of work, the annual cost for the support of their families would amount 50 million Austrian crown years. However, an insufficient relief effort might inflict an even greater damage on the national economy. Due to the war, there was already a shortage of workforce, as we have seen also in Bundespaper and the statistics she showed to us, and hence every man capable of work had to be preserved. Sterowitz calculated that the loss of 100,000 prisoners would amount to an annual loss of 100 million Austrian crowns for the national economy. Besides these financial and economic motives, also military considerations came into play. And Sterowitz wrote, and I quote, that the army itself needs every man to ensure that the state develops the sufficient power is of course clear. Quote end. So if one looks on the tremendous losses which the Austrian-Hungarian army already has suffered between 1914 and 16, then the importance of these military conflicts became evident. So to sum up, considering the great number of Austrian-Hungarian prisoners abroad, the poor living conditions, especially in Russian camps, the implementation of nationality policies by Russia and Italy, and the anticipation of the prisoners that their government would care properly for them, it is obvious that the POWs had to be an issue of high concern for the Austrian government. The officials in charge were quite aware of the potential political, economical, and military threats that might arise if the monarchy fails to assist its imprisoned soldiers in a substantial and sufficient manner. Hence we can conclude that concerns about the future of